Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 5th of April 2019, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're delighted to be joined by David Ellis, two Davids. David Ellis from Strategic Defence Initiative, David Scott from Northern Exposure, and of course David reporting from north of the border. Well, good news, we're out the EU.
No, we're not.
Oh.
But don't worry about it. Let's see what was going on. Well, the day before yesterday, of course, Yvette Cooper brought a bill to Parliament to force the Prime Minister to push for an extension to the Article 50 process, as everybody knows. And that went through the House of Commons by one vote on Wednesday night. And then it was being debated in the House of Lords yesterday. Well, here is Lord Adonis' attitude to it. It was like holding a riot in a morgue, is how he described it. And he was bitterly complaining about the number of Lords who were filibustering. So he said on Twitter this morning, House of Lords just adjourned after 12 hours on the Yvette Cooper bill, 7 hours of it a filibuster by Brexiters. We complete consideration on Monday, well in time for next week's crucial European Council to agree a long extension of Article 50. Well, the House of Lords were debating this. Lord Owen had some very interesting points to make, and of course he wasn't filibustering to try to just divert this whole thing. He was making a serious constitutional point, as were many of the other people that Lord Adonis is pretty unhappy with. Of course, he's a Labour Party peer, so he would be, and it's Yvette Cooper's bill, so he would be upset that there was a delay to it. But really, they were making serious constitutional points. But actually, it makes no difference because, as many people will know by now, Theresa May has written this morning to Donald Tusk. And the key paragraph here is, I'm writing therefore to inform the European Union that the United Kingdom is seeking a further extension of the period provided under Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union. The United Kingdom proposes that this period should end on 30th of June 2019. Well, Donald Tusk's attitude to this was, I paraphrase here slightly, but it was tell you what, Theresa, how about we give it 12 months? And if you lot can actually agree on something, write to me again. And instead of moving the date further back, we'll move it forward instead. So that seems to be Donald Tusk's position at the moment. But Brian, continuing shenanigans in Parliament, which the House of Lords, I believe, rightly pointing out, represent constitutional crisis.
Yes, and of course the other thing to keep your eye on is that there was that long cabinet meeting with closed doors where the rest of the backbenchers have absolutely no idea what's going on, and then the cabinet doors open and they simply get told what they should be believing and what they should be saying. That's one thing happening, but the other thing happening is, I think, significant, because we're starting to see people holding their MPs to account now. This was a letter sent in, excuse me, that was sent to a constituent of Christopher Pincher MP, and in it he's detailing that he's detailing how he has been voting, and he says, "You're receiving this update as you've recently contacted me about Brexit, either personally or as part of a mass campaign. Hundreds of my constituents have contacted me regarding their views over Brexit over the last month." And he's saying that, this is his way of keeping them informed what he's doing. So we often say, Mike, how do we get people to do things? This is absolute evidence that when people do hold their MPs to account, they write, they contact them, they get into those surgeries, the MPs start to respond because, of course, they're scared of losing their seats. Let's just show you this one. Here comes Johnny. This is local MP Johnny Mercer. He sends around this sort of briefing sheet to keep people informed. And he says it's an incredibly difficult time in politics. There's a collision going on between a House of Commons that's being dragged kicking and screaming into 2019 and the country which it serves. Brexit has become the defining issue that has stripped bare the shortcomings of the career politicians that have dominated British political life for too long, unable seemingly to grasp the true essence of their role. And on he goes. Now, I just wanted to show you that here with Politics Home, very interesting image with Johnny alongside Theresa. This is when he was campaigning in Plymouth. Tory MP Johnny Mercer says party could be wiped out at a snap election. And then he uses some fascinating language because he says, I'll read the little piece out here. He says, the backbencher, seen as a rising star in the Tories, added that the party needs to change its top team and adopt a more moderate brand of conservatism if its fortunes are to be rescued. There's this massive disengaged centre that the elite would have us think are just not interested in politics. That's rubbish. They've never been more connected. They're just waiting to be set on fire by good, competent, modern centre-right aspirational future politics. It's really exciting. I honestly believe it's going to be, quote, like dropping a match into petrol. What do you think he's saying here, Mike?
Well, I'm not clear, to be honest.
It's worrying language, isn't it? But he admits there's an elite. He doesn't say we need to get rid of the elite and get back to constitutional politics. And let's remember that this is the same Johnny Mercer that when he was told the Conservatives had said they planned to introduce chaos into the country, his reaction was to block us from Twitter. So for people who don't know, we're going to say, can you keep an eye on Johnny Mercer, because we can't comment now on his Twitter page. But what he didn't like was the fact that former Conservative MP Nick Bowles had publicly stated several years ago, chaotic effects in our Conservative vocabulary are a good thing. And his colleague, the parliamentary candidate Danny Kruger, has said the Conservatives plan, quote, to introduce a period of creative destruction in public services. And I'm going to say I think that's what we're witnessing. So Johnny Mercer, very frightened of the truth. We should perhaps be frightened of him for that. And then we have this sort of thing. So we've got Gabrielle Pogrund, who is the political and investigative reporter for the Sunday Times. He tweeted out a couple of days ago an exclusive. The Sunday Times has obtained secret footage of Dominic Grieve's association meeting last night, in which Conservative members shouted traitor, lies and liar repeatedly. Just listen to the boos and jeers. Now, this is a very significant tweet because just as we've got Tony Blair popping up into politics, we've got Alistair Campbell. And what did he have to say here? TV radio show should not allow any text or comment which labels MPs on any side or indeed anyone else traitor. Every single MP is having to make incredibly difficult choices. The constant use of the language of treason and treachery is straight out of the hard right playbook. I think he protests too much on this one, Mike.
Well, indeed, they have plenty to protest about. But David Ellis, let me bring you into the programme first. There is a lot of strong language going around, the use of treason and traitor and so on. But if anybody had listened to the House of Lords debate yesterday, they were in fact recognising that there's potentially some justification for that, because they were highlighting, multiple members of the House of Lords highlighting the constitutional vandalism that's been going on in the last few months. And of course, that would be treason, would it not?
Well, if you'd listen to Lord Owen, I suggest people go and have that's a good place to start. There were others there, but start with him that were putting a fight up and resistance. They were using very, very strong language. And you could clearly see the reaction on the Labour benches opposite, where what are we looking at really? This is a joint sort of drive by Tony Blair through all the sort of conduits that he's got to have us by any means remain in the EU. So if Alistair Campbell there, he's 2IC, is wanting to control the narrative and saying that, look, we can't use this sort of language. Really, what everybody's got to do is take the nod from Alistair there and actually escalate the language.
Absolutely. Now, David Scott, let's welcome you to the programme. And let's start off with this one because, of course, EU military union continuing to be an issue not discussed as part of this Brexit process. And here we have Guy Verhofstadt yesterday pushing this out on Twitter. For 70 years, NATO has been a cornerstone of our security. Now it is vital we strengthen NATO by building its European pillar based on a European defence community and a European army, so that Europeans can take their future into their own hands.
So there's no doubt about that then. It's nice and clear. At least on the continent, it's clear. The identity is European. The sovereignty is European. The control is European. And the army is European. So, yes, this is still not being discussed to any significant extent in the House of Commons. How long before that particular dam bursts?
Indeed. Now, in the meantime, there has been some movement here. So here we have a statement from Admiral Sir Philip Jones. Our retired admirals and generals and our honorary officers all have an important, enduring role as advocates for the service. Today's briefing was a great opportunity to bring them up to speed on the latest developments affecting Royal Navy and Royal Marines. So what was he discussing at this briefing?
Well, we don't really know because this is the strange thing here. We've got senior retired warrant officers and other veterans standing up outside the Ministry of Defence and talking about EU military union, talking about what might be happening to the aircraft carriers, talking about what's going to happen to sell Her Majesty's Armed Forces into European single point command and control. Now, the senior officers are not saying anything about this. But immediately after that speech, they were all called in to have tea and crumpets and be briefed by people with a lot of gold braid, a lot of egg on their hats, to say exactly what the line is. It looks like shoring up the narrative to me.
And in the meantime, change of foot for EU NAV4.
Well, yes, I think it's always interesting to watch senior members of serving military. This is Major General Strickland, commander of the Royal Marines, handing over a EU flag in a ceremony where he hands over control over the Somalia expedition to an admiral from Spain, and this is also the headquarters has been relocated to Spain at the same time. So that's the handing over of responsibility. That's the handing over of the flag. Whose flag has that man been serving in the previous weeks and months? The EU flag.
Yeah, well, perhaps David Ellis can expand on that a little bit.
Well, we've seen his former Royal Marine Commandant General, McGowan, heading up EU NAV4 there at Northwood, and using pretty much the Twitter feed for that as an entire political promotion of EU NAV4. So for anybody that doesn't know, that's EU Navy. So we've got EU Navy being headed up and operated from Royal Navy HQ Northwood, where they run Trident nuclear submarines, with the Commandant General of the Royal Marines, who's under Her Majesty's Armed Services. So you can see here the radical, this is hiding in plain view, hiding in everybody's plain sight. Well, it ought to be politically. It ought to be like hitting a cow's backside with a banjo in Parliament, but and yet the MP is still refusing to speak about it. So McGowan handed over to Strickland there. Strickland's been doing it for a while. There's been a lot of pressure put on this, and they've now moved it to Spain, and you can see the handover there. Now, the flag that he's handing over, as Simon Bean rightly pointed out when he spoke in London on the stage, is an Admiralty flag. It is embroidered with gold braid. So this should alert every single old officer, because they should see and understand that, and they should now be putting their thinking caps on about what that actually means for their legacy and the future legacy of our sons and daughters. So everybody's got to sort of wake up here. They've got a bit irritable because we've put a lot of pressure on it being there at Northwood, and they've moved it over to Spain. But obviously the thing hasn't stopped EU Navy is alive and kicking, and it's alive and kicking with the Royal Navy and with the Royal Marines, which we are paying tax for.
Yep.
And our people are serving in. So I don't quite understand why our MPs aren't talking about this in any kind of substance.
Well, let's see what our illustrious government is up to then. Well, the G7, there's a G7 meeting taking place at the moment. In fact, two separate meetings taking place at the moment. Now, France has the presidency of the G7 at the moment. So Monsieur Macron there, looking very pleased with himself. Well, what have they been up to? Well, it's all about interior ministers. The interior ministers meeting was taking place yesterday and today. So we'll start off with that one. Security and counter-terrorism are the priorities of this meeting. And they're going to set down joint commitments on security and counter-terrorism. They're going to discuss the current state of the terrorist threat. In particular, they say they're going to discuss the management of foreign terrorist fighters who've joined Daesh in Syria and in Iraq, and their families. And they're also going to examine the challenges of combating the use of the internet to pursue terrorism and violent extremism. So that's all very good. Well, here they all are. Well, there is our Interior Minister on the left-hand side, Sajid Javid. So let's have a look and see what he was saying. Vital discussions at the G7 around online terror content, especially after horrors of Christchurch. I made clear our upcoming online harms white paper will ensure social media firms take more responsibility. Much more global action needed in this area. So more censorship on the way. He went on to say, also had a constructive session on our joint work to tackle foreign terrorist fighters. Critical we all continue to explore what international mechanisms can be used to bring these people to justice. So that is what the interior ministers have been discussing yesterday and today. It's continuing today, but in parallel with that is the foreign ministers meeting, and that starts today and finishes tomorrow, and that's taking place in Dinard on the Atlantic coast of France. And of course, what are they talking about? Combating inequality through a renewed partnership with Africa. So this is all about Africa, well, there's more than just Africa, but let's just remember what we were pushing out on Twitter yesterday. We mentioned this on Wednesday's news program, but let's just remind ourselves about this once again.
First of all, our collective defense, we are ironclad committed to NATO. NATO of 29, that is collective defense Article 5. But there are problems and issues where I do not see NATO, but Europe has to be able to act.
Though this transatlantic alliance with America is extremely important and we need to maintain it, the best partnership is a partnership where we have our own capabilities that are also strong.
I was talking about Africa. This is not a typical place for NATO. We are very committed to NATO in other places, but Africa is a place where we need to be able to act as Europeans.
For example, one of the things that my institute does is work in Africa, and at the moment we're particularly focused on the Sahel group of countries. That's that band of countries across the north part of sub-Saharan Africa, where you've got exploding populations, dire poverty, radicalization and extremism. We may well face the next wave of migration and extremism from those countries. It makes perfect sense for Europe to have the military capability to help those countries with their security.
And for that, we created the European Defence Union,
right,
to have a comprehensive approach with diplomacy, economic development, and the military means.
So that's pretty clear. Now, in this article on the G7 website, they're even clearer. They say, to succeed together, the goal of the French G7 presidency will be to forge a partnership with Africa as equals, working throughout the year and until the Brexit summit with countries that play a leading role on the continent. The priority will be, with our partners, to come up with concrete tools to foster sustainable economic development in Africa, and the particular focus is on the Sahel countries. This is exactly what Tony Blair was saying. So That's going on there, David, the two Davids. If I could ask David Ellis for a bit of comment here first. This is being couched in language of economic development, but this, as we've said before, is about the expansion of the European Union southwards into the sub-Saharan, at least as far south as the sub-Saharan parts of Africa. And EU military defence union is a key foundation of this. It's one of the drivers for this.
Absolutely. The script that von der Leyen, German government, and Tony Blair are using is exactly the same script. Now, you see the overlaying key factors of one of military, and really what can we say that's the potential there for to happen? They're talking about to help those African countries with their security. What does that actually mean? And I would submit this, that should you want to make effectively what's going to be an Africa core in that area, you're going to be recruiting. So it's not, one of the biggest factors there will be just how they go about that, because there's a huge amount of unrest, and should somebody start to propagate sort of the EU having a foothold over there, then they're going to be recruiting for soldiers and sailors and airmen and so on and so forth. And then the question is what is the EU going to do with those personnel?
Well, can I just come in there and say my opinion? What the EU is going to do is it's going to destabilise North Africa. It's going to get in socially. It's going to get in politically. It'll be done on the back of aid. It'll be done on soft power discussion for help for Africa. You will then see destabilisation to get that migration moving. Tony Blair knows that's coming, and that will then be used as the excuse to unleash the new EU Africa Corps into North Africa. It will be the EU that destabilises those African countries without question.
And David Scott, just very briefly, I mean, the question we were asking on Twitter yesterday was, whose policy is it? Is it the Germans' policy? Is it Tony Blair's policy? Now we've got a third player in the mix. It's the G7. It appears to be the French G7 presidency's policy as well. So whose policy is this?
It's a globalist policy. It's a globalist policy. A lot of these things you can trace it back to the UN. Well, I would have to say, Africa Corps, yes, but it's the speed that things are moving at we're perhaps not quite aware of. I was looking at this as we were just preparing for the broadcast today. This report went on at 12:27. EU voices concern as Libya strongman Haftar orders advance on Tripoli. Libyan strongman Khalifa Haftar orders his troops on Thursday, the 4th of April, to advance on Tripoli, seat of internationally recognised unity government, as world powers, that means Europe, warned of consequences for military action. We need to get those panzers rolling now.
Well, okay. Well, of course, you can't have a foreign ministers meeting of the G7 without Jeremy Hunt.
I'm just on my way to a G7 foreign ministers meeting in France. G7 is the largest democracies in the world, and what we'll be talking about are the threats to democracy. And two of the biggest threats to democracy at the moment are, first of all, cyber attacks, interference in democratic processes from hostile states. We don't have a proper strategy to deter those attacks. I want to sort that out, and I want Britain to take a lead in doing that. Secondly, the threats to media freedom all over the world. We'll be launching a major global campaign to try and stop this happening so that journalists can carry on doing their job.
Yes.
So I had to smile at that one.
Well, it gets better because, well, here we are. They are pushing for media freedom. And who are they getting to push for media freedom? Well, you know, a couple of years ago, the Foreign Office made Angelina Jolie a kind of ambassador to campaign against sexual violence and war. So they just love their celebrities. So they've decided that they're going to use Amal Clooney as a media freedom ambassador to fight for free speech worldwide. So if anybody doesn't know who Amal Clooney is. Well, of course, she's married to George Clooney, the Hollywood actor. She's a human rights lawyer, allegedly, and an activist, allegedly. She's apparently been campaigning to free imprisoned journalists around the world. She's a friend of the Duchess of Sussex. She would apparently be delighted to see President Assad prosecuted. The Clooney Foundation for Justice gave $3.25 million to UNICEF in 2017. She accuses Hamas of indiscriminate attacks on Israel, and in fact in 2014 she refused to work for the UN to investigate possible war crimes in Gaza, so she's clearly extremely pro-Israeli. And of course she attended the White Helmets movie premiere in London. So that's a bit about her, but she has been made this ambassador. And Jeremy Hunt also announced plans when he was making his introduction on this for an international conference co-hosted by Britain and Canada, which is going to promote media freedom and the safety of journalists. Apparently it's going to be held in London in July, so this is really good stuff. So let's have a look and see what he had to say. He said the aim is to shine a spotlight on the abuses and raise the price for those who would harm or lock up journalists. In a couple of years' time, when they're wanting to lock up alternative media people in this country, we will have to remind him that he said this. But anyway, it goes on. He went on. He said, "Our national interests are best served when our values of freedom are shared by other countries."
Yeah, our values.
Yes.
That isn't UK values. This is
It's something else.
This is the government of occupation's values.
Absolutely. And he went on to say, Britain's job is to take that message to the world, and I will do everything possible to help journalists to work in safety. So, David Scott, my first question here is, why would the British Foreign Office be so concerned about this issue? When there's so much that the British government is doing at the moment to shut down free speech, as Brian's going to talk about shortly, in terms of their censorship agenda. Is this because journalists in other countries are working on behalf of the Foreign Office, and the Foreign Office wants to make sure they can continue to do their jobs, perhaps? I'm just fascinated by the fact that there seems to be a bit of schizophrenia going on here.
It's a good word, Mike. It's a very strange. Jeremy Hunt went on and he basically said Trump, Russia, possible collusion. It's like the Mueller report never happened. And then we had all this strange word about press freedom, but we know we're seeing more and more assaults on press freedom at home if you're off message. So is this word starting to mean something else? Does it mean well-regulated lies? Is that what press freedom now signifies to them?
I think that's a very good way to put it, indeed.
It's not what we think it is. You've talked about the language before, David, so they're using words we think we know what they're talking about, but we don't, because they've got completely different meanings. I just see now an accelerating picture of the British government attempting to close down and censor free speech everywhere, and I think the reason for that is because people are clearly seeing through this new language.
Okay, let's move on to child abuse, David. And first of all, a bit of good news, perhaps. This is the Mirror. The headline is ex-Medhamsley detention prison officers jailed after physically abusing boys.
Yes, we've got 1,500 men came forward and complained about the abuse they'd suffered in Medhamsley. One example, John McGee, 75, was jailed for 2 years, 10 months following a conviction for misconduct in a public office and assault. He was standing more than 6 foot tall. He punched a new 5-foot inmate in the face, who then soiled himself in fear. McGee forced him to bunny hop down a corridor to clean himself up. That gives you an idea of what was going on there. We are seeing a total of 1,676 men came forward to say they'd been subject to abusive treatment while housed in the centre, which was renowned for applying the short, sharp, short form of justice. 70 detectives were involved in Operation Seabrook, and the 2 further officers will face sentencing later this month. And I'll just have to say, I don't think any of this would have happened if it wasn't for the documentary made by Bill Maloney.
Yes, which is the image on the right-hand side of that.
Yeah, that's the Medhamsley Heroes, which people can easily find online. And of course, we've got ICSA going on at the moment, doesn't want to speak to people such as Bill Maloney because they got too much information about the child abuse.
But David, in the meantime, as well, the headline here is as Amazon bans vaccine documentary, child sex dolls openly sold on their website.
Yes, there's quite a bit recently, and indeed a year ago in the British press about the importation of child sex dolls, and it's been sold on Amazon's website, as it says. Despite their extremely prompt censorship of politically incorrect ideas like the problems with vaccines or books by people like Tommy Robinson, child sex dolls seem to be okay. Now, this is something that is a huge concern. It's a growing problem. Here we see the Sun reporting on it, and also it's been reported in the Independent in the last few days. And the concern is that this is going to promote more paedophilia. These are dolls that are anatomically correct, they're very lifelike, and they're often bought by paedophiles who've already got a criminal record. There's been some suggestion that this will prevent people offending. There doesn't seem to be any evidence for that. It seems to be much more likely that it will promote offending. Now, this was a type of doll that was used in the Violate Club, a fetish club founded by an Airdrie lawyer, and it was for talking about the Violate Club, which is attended by teachers and politicians and people in the judiciary and people in the police, that Robert Greene was arrested and taken out of his home and locked up in a Scottish jail cell. The police didn't want to talk about anything that he'd been accused of. They just wanted to talk about what he knew about the Violate Club. So my question is, if we're seeing dolls imported that have been defined as obscene, right, and the Crown Prosecution Service is saying they're going to prosecute people who import these, why are we not seeing a consistent approach to policing where the clubs that use them are subject to scrutiny instead of the people who raise the alarm?
Yeah, and we just highlight, of course, that Amazon, they're cutting out any criticism of vaccines. That is being suppressed, and also the film Vaxxed has been cut out by Amazon, the same Amazon that's quite happy to sell these sex dolls. At this point, I'm just going to remind people that Melanie Shaw is now in Rampton Mental Hospital. We're trying to find out more information, but it is exceptionally difficult because all communication around her has been shut down. I'm going to say, I say that this is a Conservative government cover-up. Theresa May was Home Secretary at the time that Melanie was suffering most, and to spend over 18, probably over 19 months in solitary confinement, no wonder that Melanie is now needing help, supposedly in Rampton. Do we trust this government on Brexit? We don't trust it on child abuse. I think it's pretty clear what sort of elite are running the country at the moment.
Right, David, common law courts, we've discussed this before with respect to people involved with the common law court being taken, being arrested and charged with criminal offences. But what's the latest on this?
Well, after 3 days and a good bit of taxpayers' money, the statute courts essentially walked away from this. They did not establish that they had any authority over a living man. They wouldn't answer questions about the difference between a living man and a person. And the charge against an officer of the common law court was abandoned after 3 days of essentially harassment through the statute court system. So this strikes me as a very major milestone, because there's an assault been made on the common law court. They didn't touch the paperwork. They didn't challenge the lawfulness of what was happening. They went after the individuals and tried to get them on breach of the peace, which is in Scotland is a catch-all charge of social control. And it failed. And it failed because the person concerned stood up and he proclaimed that he was a flesh and blood human being and that they had no jurisdiction, and they were not able to establish jurisdiction, and they were not able to move forward. So a very significant thing. One other report I've had from the common law court was regarding a case in Portsmouth, where someone was evicted from their home. I'll just read out what they've told me about this. The mortgage company used the statutory court system to overcome work being done by the common law court and unlawfully evicted a man from his home in Portsmouth. A bailiff created and signed an apparently fraudulent eviction notice to evict a living man using the name of a company that had ceased trading for over 3 years, and obtained the assistance of 7 police officers to assault and physically remove the living man from his home, thereby committing a crime. The living man who was evicted, knowing that he was right in standing under the common law court jurisdiction, returned to his home after informing the police, the Crown Court and the High Court that crimes had been committed, and that the High Court wants nothing to do with the granting of an order. The County Court are running for cover. The warrant for eviction has disappeared, and the police are trying to get out of it by treating the reported crime as a complaint rather than as police officers committing a crime and breaking the law. So we're seeing here people standing on the law, and the fraudulent system that's abusing their rights is starting to run for cover. It's something we'll keep a very close eye on. It's very encouraging.
Okay, good stuff. Yeah. Right, now let's head over to the other side of the Atlantic, because Patrick Henningsen and I on Monday's program were talking about Joe Biden. Joe Biden has subsequently made a video where he was apologizing for his inappropriate touching of females, apparently, and was clearly hoping that as a result of that video clip that he would be able to continue as a Democratic candidate for the forthcoming general election for president. Now, just before we get to see what Donald Trump has done about this, I just wanted to show this little clip here, because this is the little clip that Donald Trump was commenting on. Joe Biden putting his hands on this lady's shoulders and whispering in her ear. Well, Donald Trump decided to push out this tweet. He said, "Welcome back, Joe," and with this tweet was a little bit of video. So let's have a look at that. Here he is. And well, Joe seems to be in the background. Joe's in the foreground. He's talking, but he seems to be in the background. Oh dear, he seems to have touched himself on the shoulders and is whispering in his ear. David Scott, this is a fantastic Mickey take of the situation, and it's really hard to see how Biden can politically recover from this.
No, isn't it magnificent? This is the sort of thing that it was partly due to the Trump win, responsible for the Trump win, because there was a means of communicating ideas that the mainstream media had no control over, right? So no mainstream source, CNN or any of these people, would put out anything against Joe Biden. They wouldn't mention that he's known as Creepy Joe. But now this meme and the internet passing this information around has made this real for people. You see here some of the memes that are doing the rounds. You see the sign for Biden 2020 with 2 little grabby hands. This is absolutely devastating. It reminds me of the time during the Trump campaign when the mainstream media were wall to wall going after Trump about his treatment of women. It was everywhere. It was 24/7. And on the internet, we had a lot of information circulating about Bill Clinton and how he treated women, and the allegations against Bill Clinton were much more severe. And Bill Clinton was making a speech on the stump on behalf of his wife, and he got to a dramatic pause. He said, "This thing we know for sure," and he paused for dramatic effect, and there was a voice from the audience, some hero who'd seen this, and the hero shouted out, "You're a rapist." And I thought Trump's going to win the election, because here you had 24/7 coverage attacking Trump and the internet saying something else, and what was actually working. So this is another example of the mainstream media failing to actually control the narrative. You see here's one more sort of sign that you can even buy a t-shirt. You can buy a Biden 2020 t-shirt with hands inappropriately touching you on the t-shirt. This is terminal for his political career. It's all over for Joe Biden. I'm sorry. Goodbye.
Well, indeed. No, but if we put this this first slide back up again, and I just want to highlight the one that's in the top right-hand corner here, creepy Joe Biden and stranger danger. And David, this is a key point, because the point I was making the other day on the news program was he hasn't just been touching women, it's also been children. And well, this little video clip here is the video that meme was highlighting, and really I found this particularly disturbing.
Yes.
Yes, it's very difficult to watch, and someone has made an assembly of videos like this that goes on for about 5 minutes, and it's extremely difficult to watch all the way through because there's so much of this, and you see the obvious distress and discomfort of girls who are, little girls just at the point where they're about to become big girls, and it's really creepy.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Well, indeed, that's an appropriate name.
Perhaps we can just give our audience a reminder that the US political establishment, of course, managed to escape the Boys Town accusations. People can find that video on YouTube, but it does appear that there is something wrong in the US political system, much as there is in UK at the moment. Well, let's just end on the subject of censorship, because it's here. And Louise Collins carried out an interview with Mark Steele on the subject of the dangers of 5G. She says, I had a lovely chat with Mark Steele today on the dangers and health implications of 5G. Links to Mark's website are in the article, with useful letter templates and flyers, these so that people could register their own concerns with local authorities, MPs, whatever. Embedded in this is a picture of Mark Steele, and she's saying Mark encourages those who are concerned to get in front of representatives, basically. And if we add a bit that I just suppressed, this is what Facebook did. They said, this post goes against our community standards, so no one else can see it. So blatant censorship there by Facebook, simply of concerns over 5G and health risks. On the contrary, if we have a look at this Facebook entry, we've got somebody very upset at their son attending an LGBTQ++ rally. And what are they saying? If you see my son, tell him he's a dead man. And then there's a lot of abuse. This is a pretty unpleasant posting, but no problem for Facebook at all. But if you dare criticize 5G, so double standards by Mark Zuckerberg. But what has he been up to? Well, we discovered this, that in the last couple of days, he's been talking to the government in Ireland. He says Ireland is a very important country for Facebook. Our international headquarters is in Dublin. We operate a data centre in Cluny, and our Oculus team is doing advanced research in Cork. I spent today in Dublin meeting with members of the Irish Parliament. We discussed the work Facebook is doing here and important issues around the future of the internet. I appreciated the thoughtful conversation. Well, I think we'd like to say what was discussed behind the closed doors, and can any of our UK column viewers and listeners obtain the minutes of that meeting? So we have censorship by Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg fully responsible for that, secret discussions with governments. This is very dangerous stuff. And let's remind people, of course, that our very own Nick Clegg waltzed off from politics to £1 million a year job as Facebook's head of global affairs. David, this is dangerous. We don't know whether we're dealing with global corporations or politics. Who's controlling who? Well, it seems to me the global firms have got the real money, so they will be controlling the politicians. But this is very dangerous stuff.
and preventing other politicians arising. I saw you mentioned Ireland there. I saw Gemma O'Doherty, who's trying to raise some of these issues in Ireland, and raise the issue that Ireland is being essentially taken over by an elite, just as we're seeing in Britain. And she was having a meeting, a very well attended meeting in Sligo. And she said there were people there from every single county in Ireland. But they had the meeting in the street because the venue suddenly at the last moment said, no, we don't want you. So someone had had a word and their venue was removed. So they had the meeting in the street anyway, and they had people sitting in cars, leaning on their horns to try and disrupt the meeting. So people are being harassed as they try to undertake lawful activity, like the right to assemble and the right to discuss ideas with one another.
Yeah.
Yes, censorship is everywhere.
Censorship, and I'm just going to end on this note that we have to point a finger at journalists because they have consistently failed to stand up and be counted. This is the UK column back in April 2008, where we had a major article because 3,000 people had protested outside Parliament about constitutional issues, Lisbon, and it was not reported in the Daily Mail, even though they could see most of the demonstration from their own offices. And the reason that the Daily Mail didn't print anything was because they were too busy printing, I think it was about 4 or 5 pages on plastic bags. And when we questioned the paper about their relative priorities, we were simply told, well, our editor has got a bit of a thing about plastic bags. So if there's any mainstream journalists out there who are trying to say it's not our fault what's going on in the UK, it absolutely is, and we need to make sure that social media brings those people to book as well. David, thank you very much for joining us. We'll end there, but I'd like to say thank you very much for the support we receive from the public and our close UK column supporters. If you're not already a subscriber, perhaps you consider subscribing and or donating, because we can only do this with your financial help. And I'd also like to say on behalf of Justin Walker, thank you very much to the person who made a very generous donation to the British Constitution Group over the last few days. Very important timing, as obviously constitutional issues are now at the forefront, or should be at the forefront of news in UK. That's it from us. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back at the same time on Monday. Bye-bye.